A Denver winter night was thick with snow when Officer Daniel Carter walked his lonely patrol. He thought it would be just another shift in the cold, until he spotted a fragile girl shivering beneath a street lamp, her thin coat no match for the storm. At her side stood Max, a German shepherd with fire in his eyes, guarding her like an angel sent from above. She whispered only 4 words, "Don't say anything. Someone's watching." And in that moment, Daniel's life changed forever. What followed would reveal betrayal, courage, and the quiet miracles God still works among us. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe every child deserves a safe place to call home, hit that subscribe button, because what you are about to hear may restore your faith in love, family, and second chances. Winter had laid its heaviest hand upon the city of Denver, and the streets bore silent testimony to the season's cruel grip. Snow blanketed the sidewalks in uneven mounds, piled high against brick buildings and street lamps that flickered like weary guardians of the night. The air itself seemed alive with frost, every exhaled breath turning instantly to mist and hanging in the darkness. The wind swept down from the Rockies with a ferocity that could slice through the thickest coat, and even the usually bustling city had fallen into a muted hush, its sounds muffled by the curtain of falling snow. Only the crunch of boots against ice disturbed the stillness, steady and deliberate, belonging to a man who walked alone. Officer Daniel Carter moved carefully through the dimly lit streets, his duty jacket zipped to the throat but still offering little comfort against the gnawing cold. Daniel was 34 years old, tall at 6 feet with a solid build that reflected years of both police training and the kind of physical labor he had grown up with. His hair was dark brown, kept short and practical beneath his cap, though a few strands of early gray showed near the temples, subtle markers of a life that had already known its share of burdens. His hazel eyes carried a sharpness that never rested, eyes trained by both habit and necessity to read danger in shadows and sincerity in faces. There was something steady about him, a calm weight in the way he moved, though it was tempered by an undercurrent of melancholy he could not quite hide. That sadness had roots long before his badge, his mother's death when he was only 12, a tragedy that had stripped childhood innocence and left him with a hard-earned resilience. Raised by an uncle who worked nights at a steel mill, Daniel had learned early what survival meant in a world that gave nothing freely. That history shaped him into a man who was cautious but compassionate, someone who carried discipline in his posture yet harbored a quiet ache for the lost warmth of family. Tonight, his breath fogged as he walked his patrol through lower downtown, a district where the glow of bars and coffee shops had dimmed early under the weather's weight. The streets looked abandoned, except for a few cars buried halfway under snowdrifts, and storefronts shuddered against the cold. Daniel scanned routinely, his hand brushing near his holster, not from immediate threat, but from ingrained instinct. It was then, just as he turned onto a side street, that he saw her. At first she appeared only as a shadow pressed against the side of a building, a fragile silhouette trembling beneath the snowflakes that swirled under the streetlight's weak halo. Then, as he drew nearer, the details emerged. A small girl no more than 10 years old, wrapped in a torn winter coat far too thin for the night, her boots scuffed and leaking, her fingers raw and red from exposure. Her hair, a tangle of light brown strands, clung wetly to her cheeks, and her face was pale under the street lamp, her lips trembling from more than just the cold. Her name, he would learn soon, was Emily Parker. But at this moment she was just a fragile figure in the snow, clutching desperately to something at her side. That something shifted, growled low, and revealed itself as a German shepherd standing protectively in front of her. The dog's coat was a mix of black and tan, thick fur dusted white by the falling snow, muscles taut under the ragged ribs of a body that had known hunger but never surrendered its strength. His ears stood erect, his amber eyes glowing like coals, as he fixed his gaze on the alleyway behind Daniel. The dog, whom the girl would later call Max, gave the impression of both age and youth. He was about 6 years old, strong and alert, his body scarred in small ways that spoke of skirmishes on the streets. Yet his movements showed the loyalty of a guardian who would not hesitate to die for his companion. Daniel slowed, his breath visible as he studied them. He had seen homeless children before, but there was something different here, an intensity in the way the girl held herself, as if her fear was not only of the cold, but of something present and immediate. She pressed her small body against Max's side, her knuckles white as they clutched his fur. Her eyes lifted to Daniel's, and though they were wide with fear, there was also a flicker of defiance, as though she had learned the world would not always offer kindness, and she had armed herself with distrust. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper carried on the icy wind. "Don't say anything. Someone's watching." Daniel froze. He had expected a plea for food or warmth, perhaps even silence born from trauma, but these words carried the urgency of a warning. He straightened, scanning the shadows, his instincts sharpening. Max growled again, a deep rumble in his chest that vibrated through the still air, his hackles rising. The dog's eyes never left the alleyway, and Daniel, a man who trusted both training and instinct, felt his pulse quicken. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to the girl's level, though keeping his eyes half on the alley. "What's your name?" he asked gently, his voice steady but calm. The girl shook her head quickly, her lips pressed together, snowflakes clinging to her lashes. She seemed unwilling to answer, but her grip on Max tightened, and the dog took a step forward as if to reinforce her silence. Then, after a pause, she whispered again, "He followed us." "He's still there." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He knew well enough that children did not invent fear this specific without cause. He positioned himself so his body was half shielding the girl while his hand rested firmly near his holstered weapon. The snow fell heavier, coating their shoulders, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to the circle of light cast by the street lamp and the shadowy mouth of the alley beyond. Daniel's mind drifted briefly unbidden but sharp back to his own childhood. He remembered a night much like this, the Colorado winter seeping through thin blankets after his mother's funeral, the hollow emptiness in the house as his uncle worked late shifts. He had curled into himself, wishing for warmth, for someone to stand guard against the dark, and now, standing here, he saw himself reflected in the trembling child before him. Emily Parker, though. Daniel did not yet know her name, was not just a lost girl in the snow. She was a mirror of every lonely night he had endured, every hunger for safety he had once felt. And beside her, the dog Max embodied the loyal protector he himself had never had. The snow swirled harder, wind pushing it into their faces, as if the storm itself bore witness to the fragile tableau. A weary officer, a child who had been cast aside, and a dog whose growl declared he would not yield. Daniel tightened his jaw, eyes fixed on the darkness of the alley, silently promising himself one thing. Whatever danger lurked there, this child and her dog would not face it alone. The snow had thickened into a relentless curtain, the flakes swirling under the yellow street lamp until it seemed the world was dissolving into white. Daniel Carter stood rigid, his breath visible in sharp bursts, one hand near his holster, the other subtly motioning for the small girl to stay behind him. Emily Parker clung tighter to Max's thick fur, her thin frame trembling in the cold, but her eyes remained fixed on the darkness of the alley. Max's growl deepened, his hackles bristling like needles under the sheen of snowflakes that had begun to cling to his coat. Then, without warning, the shadows shifted. A man lurched forward from the alley, his outline jagged against the snow-smeared wall. He looked to be in his late 30s, wiry but dangerous, his body twitching with nervous energy. His coat was tattered leather, worn to the point where seams split along the shoulders, and his jeans were stiff with grime and frost. His face, partially hidden beneath the shadow of an unkempt beanie, revealed a pair of eyes darting frantically, bloodshot with either fear or addiction. In his right hand, glinting under the thin streetlight, was a knife, the blade catching snowflakes and reflecting them like fragments of ice. His name, though Daniel would only learn it later, was Kyle Mercer, a man who had once been a mechanic, but had fallen into a spiral of substance abuse after the collapse of his marriage. Years of bitterness had carved deep lines into his face, and the permanent tension in his jaw spoke of anger that never truly rested. Tonight, he looked less like a man and more like a predator forced into a corner, dangerous not from strength but from desperation. "Stay back," Kyle snarled, his voice hoarse from cold and smoke. The knife trembled in his grip, but his stance was aggressive, the kind of reckless posture of someone too unstable to bluff. Daniel's muscles tensed as he began to draw his firearm, but before he could act, Emily's voice pierced the storm. "Don't shoot!" she cried, her tone shrill, carrying an odd blend of fear and certainty. For a moment, it startled even Daniel, Her words froze him mid-motion, a flicker of doubt slipping into his usually sharp instincts. Why was she so sure? Did she know this man? Or was she terrified of more violence than what already threatened to unfold? Max answered in his own language, lunging forward with a bark that echoed off the brick walls. The German shepherd's body was a coiled spring of power, his paws digging into the snow as he bounded toward Kyle. The attacker stumbled back, his knife slashing outward wildly. Max's jaws snapped near his arm, not yet making contact but close enough to force Kyle off balance. Daniel took the opportunity, stepping forward and leveling his weapon, the barrel unwavering despite the icy wind. "Drop it!" Daniel commanded, his voice like steel cutting through the storm. Kyle's eyes flicked between the officer, the girl, and the snarling dog. He hissed through his teeth, raising the knife higher as though that simple defiance could tilt the balance. The snow crunched suddenly under Daniel's boots as he adjusted his stance. Then the world broke into motion. Kyle lunged. Daniel sidestepped, his boots slipping slightly on the icy ground, but his balance held. Max slammed into Kyle's side with terrifying force, the impact sending both man and beast tumbling into the snow. The knife arced downward, scraping Daniel's sleeve but missing his flesh. Daniel raised his gun skyward and fired a single shot, the deafening crack slicing the night. The explosion of sound reverberated through the alley, startling even Max, who clamped down harder on Kyle's wrist. The knife clattered against the frozen ground, sliding toward Emily. She gasped, but had the presence of mind to kick it with her worn boot, sending it skittering across the street out of reach. Daniel surged forward, grabbing Kyle by the collar and forcing him down into the snow. The man thrashed, spitting curses that fogged in the frigid air, but Daniel's weight bore down like an anchor. Max released his grip only when Daniel barked the command, his chest heaving, ears pricked forward as he hovered ready for another strike. With a swift motion, Daniel clamped one cuff around Kyle's wrist, twisting the other arm behind his back until the ratcheting click sealed his freedom away. The fight was over. Snowflakes fell silently again, settling on the struggling man as though indifferent to human rage. Daniel exhaled, his breath clouding in the night, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his veins. He rose to his feet, dragging Kyle upright. The man's face was pale now, streaked with sweat and melted snow, his earlier fury collapsing into weary defeat. It was only then that Daniel noticed the others. A small cluster of people had gathered at the end of the street, drawn out of their warm apartments by the gunshot. Bundled in heavy coats, scarves pulled high over their noses, they stood at a safe distance, their eyes flicking between Daniel, the restrained attacker, and the small girl who stood half-hidden behind Max. A middle-aged woman with a red woolen hat leaned toward another bystander and whispered loudly enough for the sound to carry. "That girl, she's the one who's been wandering around with that mutt. Some wild child. Probably trouble." Another man, his thick coat buttoned to the chin, shook his head. "What kind of parents let a kid freeze out here? She's a stray, nothing more." The words, though not directed at Emily, fell on her like stones. Her shoulders hunched tighter, her fingers digging into Max's fur as though the dog's warmth could shield her from scorn. Her eyes, which had burned with courage only moments earlier, now lowered to the snow, dulled by shame she had not earned. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, a controlled but undeniable fire. He turned slightly, his hazel eyes locking on the gawking crowd. "She's not a stray," he said sharply, his voice carrying through the snow. "She's a child. And tonight, she helped stop a man with a knife. So unless you were planning on doing the same, keep your comments to yourself." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the whistle of the wind. The bystanders shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others muttering as they retreated toward the warmth of their buildings. None offered help, none offered comfort, only distance, as though cruelty was easier than compassion. Daniel felt Emily's gaze on him then, hesitant but grateful. Max pressed against her side, his breath steaming in the cold, his amber eyes still fixed on Kyle with an unwavering glare. Daniel tightened his grip on the cuffed man, ready to haul him toward the patrol car parked nearby. For now, the danger was subdued. But Daniel knew the night had only just begun. The snow fell thicker, covering footprints almost as soon as they were made. But the image lingered in Daniel's mind. A child branded as nothing by strangers, clutching the only family she had left, a dog who would give his life without question. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the pull of something more than duty. He wasn't just protecting the city tonight. He was protecting her. The storm had not relented by the time Daniel Carter wrestled the handcuffed attacker into the back of his patrol car. Snow piled on the roof, melting into rivulets that streaked down the glass. Emily Parker stood nearby, clutching Max's thick neck fur, her small body shivering from cold and fear. Daniel glanced at her, saw the stubborn glint in her eyes even through the frost clinging to her lashes, and made a decision. He could have called child services immediately. It would have been the correct, by-the-book action. But something deeper tugged at him, a mixture of instinct and memory that told him she didn't belong with strangers behind an institution's walls tonight. He opened the passenger door instead. "Get in," he said firmly. Emily hesitated, her lips parting as though to object, but Max nudged her forward with his muzzle. She slid onto the seat, her boots leaving wet trails of snow on the floor mat. Max leapt up after her, the car groaning under his weight, his amber eyes never leaving Daniel as though silently measuring the man's worth. They drove in silence through streets almost unrecognizable under the storm. Streetlights glowed faintly through the white curtain, storefronts shuttered, and the world seemed narrowed to the hum of the engine and the child's quiet breathing in the seat beside him. Daniel pulled into the precinct lot, where snowplows had carved narrow lanes between mounds higher than a man's shoulders. He parked near the side entrance and ushered them inside. The warmth of the lobby hit Emily like a wave, and she blinked rapidly as her body adjusted. The police station was a squat, utilitarian building, its beige walls made harsher by fluorescent lights. At the front desk sat Sergeant Mark Davies, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with thinning blonde hair and a perpetual scowl that deepened the creases around his mouth. Mark was a career officer, known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his bluntness with colleagues. He respected the law more than people, a trait hardened by years of watching fellow officers bend rules with disastrous results. Mark had once lost a partner during a botched pursuit, an accident he blamed on sloppy judgment, and since then he had zero tolerance for deviation. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Daniel entering with a snow-soaked child and a large dog. "What's this?" he asked gruffly, standing behind the counter with his arms crossed. "Temporary shelter," Daniel replied, guiding Emily forward. "She was in the alley during the attack. This is Max. They'll freeze if I leave them outside tonight." Mark's gaze shifted to Emily, then to the dog. He grunted disapprovingly. "This isn't a charity ward, Carter. Child services should handle her. And the mutt belongs at animal control." Emily stiffened, clutching Max tighter. Her eyes were wide, the fear clear. Daniel crouched to meet her gaze. "It's all right." "Just for tonight," he murmured. Then he rose and fixed his hazel eyes on Mark. "One night. I'll take responsibility." Mark studied him, jaw tight, but finally waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. But keep them out of sight. If the captain sees this, you're explaining it." Daniel led Emily and Max into a small break room with an old couch and a humming radiator. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and Emily sank onto the couch gratefully, pulling Max close. Daniel found an old blanket in a supply closet and draped it over her shoulders. For a moment she looked impossibly small, swallowed by fabric, her face pale but calmer now. As she thawed, Daniel gently asked her name. She whispered, "Emily Parker," her voice carrying the weight of someone unused to being asked. Slowly, in fragments, her story unfolded. Her mother had passed away 2 years earlier from pneumonia that went untreated. Her father, overwhelmed and angry, had turned to alcohol. One night after an argument, he left and never returned. Emily had waited, days stretching into weeks, until hunger and cold forced her onto the streets. Max had been a stray himself, a dog abandoned by a previous owner. Their paths had crossed behind a grocery store where Emily scavenged. The dog had growled at everyone else but approached her quietly, pressing his nose into her hand. Since then, they had been inseparable. They survived on discarded food, occasional kindness, and their own resilience. When Daniel asked about shelters, Emily shook her head violently. "They'll take Max away. They always say dogs aren't allowed. He's all I have." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Max pressed his head into her chest as if to confirm her claim. Daniel leaned back in his chair, conflicted. Protocol was clear. Children belonged in protective custody, dogs in kennels. Yet watching Emily cradle Max, he saw the thin line of her shoulders, the dirt beneath her nails, the hollowness in her cheeks, and he knew separating them would shatter what little hope kept her standing. His chest tightened with memory, his own nights staring at a ceiling alone, missing the mother he would never see again. He could not bring himself to inflict that kind of loss deliberately. While Emily warmed by the radiator, she pulled from her coat pocket a stubby pencil and a crumpled notebook, its pages warped from snow. Without speaking, she began to draw. Daniel watched as the lines emerged shakily, but with surprising clarity. Max, with his proud ears and deep eyes, the snow-covered street lamps casting long shadows, and even Daniel himself, his outline rendered with the uncertain strokes of a child, but unmistakably him. She pressed the pencil hard, as if each stroke carved out her longing, the yearning for stability and recognition. Daniel asked softly, "You like to draw?" Emily shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "It helps me remember, so I don't forget what it feels like. Having someone around." She didn't elaborate, but Daniel understood. These sketches were her anchors, fragile evidence of connection in a world determined to erase her. As midnight crept closer, Sergeant Mark reappeared, checking in with the suspicion of a man expecting trouble. He frowned at the sight of Emily curled on the couch beside Max. "This can't continue," he muttered. "Rules are rules." But then he noticed the notebook in her lap. He picked it up roughly, flipping through the drawings. His brows knit for a moment, then softened almost imperceptibly. He set it back down without comment and left. Daniel saw the brief flicker in Mark's expression and realized even the hardest shells could crack, though pride prevented the man from admitting it. Perhaps the drawings spoke a universal language of longing that no amount of cynicism could ignore. Later, as snow rattled softly against the windows, Daniel sat at his desk, paperwork spread before him, but unread. He glanced at Emily and Max sleeping curled together on the couch, the dog's body forming a protective wall around the girl. In the hum of the radiator and the quiet rise and fall of their breathing, he felt a strange peace. Yet beneath it lay a thorn of conflict. He knew in the morning questions would come: where to place the child, what to do about the dog. His badge demanded obedience to the law. His heart whispered otherwise. For now, he let the law wait. The storm rolled in from the Rockies like a living beast, snarling through Denver's narrow streets and burying everything in its path beneath thick, suffocating snow. The temperature plummeted further, the kind of bitter cold that clawed through clothing and stiffened the joints. By evening, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The streets were emptied of cars, shops shuttered with metal grates, and even the few souls without homes had disappeared into whatever shelters they could find. Only the roar of the wind and the rattle of ice against windows filled the night air. Daniel Carter had chosen to patrol despite warnings from dispatch to avoid unnecessary risks. His instincts told him the storm would create opportunities for people who thrived on chaos. His hazel eyes flicked constantly between snow-blurred streets and alleys as his cruiser's tires fought for grip on ice. He thought of Emily and Max, whom he had left briefly with Sergeant Mark's reluctant permission to rest in the precinct's spare cot. But something gnawed at him. He had learned long ago that danger rarely waited for convenience. His intuition proved right. A call came over the radio, reports of a disturbance near an abandoned warehouse district. Daniel responded immediately, and when he arrived, his heart clenched. Through the storm, half concealed by sheets of falling snow, he saw Emily and Max. They had wandered too far from safety. Emily's frail figure was pressed against a wall, her thin coat barely shielding her from the blizzard. 3 young men had cornered her. The men looked rough, products of hard streets and harder choices. At the center stood Derek Malone, the ringleader, 27 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight he'd once bragged about surviving. His hair was shaved close, his eyes dark and cold, always searching for weakness. Derek had grown up in foster care, shuffled from home to home, never belonging, and the resentment had hardened into cruelty. Tonight, desperation made him dangerous. Rumors had spread of a German shepherd wandering the streets, and he knew dogfighters would pay handsomely for a beast like Max. To Derek's left was Leo Vargas, thinner, wiry, his hands shaking slightly as though he hadn't eaten in days. His gaunt face carried a haunted look, his brown eyes darting nervously. Leo was the youngest of the group, barely 20, dragged into Derek's schemes more by fear than loyalty. His tattered hoodie and sneakers were poor armor against the storm, and he coughed into his sleeve between sneers. On Derek's right was Tommy Hales, built like a stocky bulldog, his nose crooked from too many street fights. Tommy's beanie was pulled low over his head, and his voice carried the gravel of someone who had smoked since adolescence. He followed Derek without question, the kind of man who mistook violence for strength. "Nice dog you got there," Derek sneered, his breath visible in the cold. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the ice. "Bet he'd fetch a good price. Hand him over, kid, and maybe you don't end up face down in the snow." Emily shook her head violently, clutching Max's collar until her knuckles turned white. "He's mine," she whispered, though her voice cracked with fear. Max bared his teeth, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. Tommy snorted. "Stupid mutt. Should have been locked up already." He reached forward and Max snapped at his hand, forcing him back with a curse. Derek's eyes narrowed. "Grab the girl. Dog'll follow." Leo hesitated, his face pale. He didn't want to hurt a child, but Derek's glare silenced him. He moved forward reluctantly, his gloved hand reaching. Emily stumbled backward, her boots sliding on the ice, and she fell hard. Her small hand hit the frozen ground, skin splitting, blood blooming red against the white snow. She cried out in pain, and Max lunged, his bark echoing like thunder. It was then that Daniel arrived. He left the cruiser door swinging open, his figure cutting through the blizzard like a force of nature. His heavy coat flared behind him, snow clinging to his shoulders, his hazel eyes burning with fury. "Step away from her," he shouted, his voice carrying even over the howling wind. The gang turned. Derek smirked but tightened his stance. "Look who's here. Officer Hero. You gonna arrest us for talking?" Daniel's hand rested firmly on his holster. "Try me," he said, low and steady. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then Tommy lunged, perhaps hoping the storm would cover his foolishness. Daniel was faster. He blocked the swing, shoved him back into the snow and drew his weapon, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound split the blizzard, sending birds scattering from broken rafters of the warehouse. Max leapt to Emily's side, positioning himself between her and Leo, his teeth flashing. Derek swore, weighing his chances. He saw the steel in Daniel's eyes and knew the fight was already lost. "Let's go," he barked at his men. Tommy scrambled up, muttering curses, while Leo cast one last conflicted glance at Emily before disappearing into the snow. Within seconds, the storm swallowed them whole. Daniel rushed to Emily, kneeling beside her. Her hand bled where the ice had torn her skin. He tore a strip of cloth from his own undershirt and wrapped it gently, his fingers surprisingly tender for a man used to rough work. "You're safe now," he murmured. Emily leaned into Max, tears freezing on her cheeks. Later that night, back at the precinct, Daniel's relief was short-lived. Captain Harold Simmons, a stocky man in his 50s with a booming voice and a reputation for strict discipline, summoned him to his office. Simmons had salt and pepper hair cropped close, a permanent crease between his brows, and a bluntness sharpened by decades in uniform. He believed officers were married to the badge, nothing else, and he had little patience for sentiment. "You've crossed a line, Carter," Simmons said, slamming his hand on the desk. "Bringing that girl here, parading her around like a project, this isn't your responsibility. You're a police officer, not a social worker." Daniel stood tall, snow still melting from his boots onto the office carpet. His jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "She saved me once. So did that dog. They warned me before an attack, and tonight they nearly lost their lives because no one else cared enough to protect them. Don't ask me to abandon them. I won't." Simmons glared at him, the silence heavy. For a moment, Daniel thought the man might suspend him on the spot. Instead, the captain leaned back in his chair, exhaling hard. "You're treading on thin ice. One mistake, and you'll answer for it." Daniel left the office with his resolve stronger than ever. He found Emily and Max waiting in the lobby, both looking worn but alive. He gave a faint smile. "Come on, let's find somewhere warm." The storm outside showed no sign of easing, so Daniel led them to an abandoned cabin he knew on the city's outskirts. It had once been used by patrolling officers years ago. Now forgotten, its wooden beams weathered but still sturdy. Inside, he struck a fire in the old stone hearth, and the flickering light painted their faces in gold and orange. Emily sat cross-legged near the fire, Max curled against her side, his head resting on her lap. Her bandaged hand rested on his fur as she whispered softly about her dreams, of sitting in a classroom, of learning to read properly, of having a real bed and a family who wouldn't leave. Daniel listened, his heart heavy, yet warmed by the simple courage in her words. The fire crackled, and for a rare moment the storm outside seemed distant. That night, Daniel understood with clarity. Emily didn't just need shelter or food. She needed a home, a place where she and Max would never again be seen as disposable. And he, perhaps more than anyone, was in a position to give her that chance. The snow lay heavy over Denver's city park, transforming the wide lawns and bare trees into a white wasteland. The lake was frozen solid, a sheet of glass beneath drifting flakes. Daniel Carter stood at the edge of the park, his boots crunching the ice, his breath fogging in the sharp air. The call had come just after dawn. A child reported missing, last seen playing with friends near the park's entrance before vanishing into the storm. Every officer had been mobilized, their dark uniforms stark against the endless white. Yet despite the numbers, hours had passed, and no trace of the boy had been found. Beside Daniel stood Emily Parker, wrapped in a heavy coat Daniel had borrowed from the precinct's lost and found, the sleeves still too long, dangling over her small hands. At her side was Max, the German shepherd, his black and tan coat speckled with snow. The dog stood alert, ears forward, nose twitching. His body seemed coiled with a purpose no one else possessed. Emily rested a small hand on his back, her eyes wide and serious. She had begged Daniel to let her help. At first he resisted, but the determination in her face, so fierce in such a fragile frame, made him relent. Nearby, Officer Sarah Jennings coordinated the search teams. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, her black hair pulled into a severe bun beneath her cap. Her pale blue eyes were sharp, the gaze of a woman who had little patience for mistakes. Years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in a drowning accident during a family camping trip. She carried that guilt like a shadow, and it made her relentless when children were in danger. She moved briskly between groups, barking orders, her breath puffing in the cold. "Carter," she called, striding toward him. "We've covered the north and west sections, no sign. Parents are hysterical, kid's only 7. If we don't find him soon—" She stopped herself, jaw tightening. Daniel nodded. He glanced at Emily. "Let's see what Max can do." Sarah frowned at the sight of the child and dog. "This isn't a game. We need trained K9 units, not—" But before she could finish, Max lowered his head, sniffing the snow where the missing boy had last been seen. His body stiffened. He barked once, sharply, then began to pull Emily toward a line of trees at the park's edge. Emily stumbled, but her eyes lit with urgency. "He's got something!" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Follow them!" The trio moved quickly, snow spraying around their boots. Max led them deeper into the park, away from the cleared paths, toward a cluster of old maintenance sheds near the frozen pond. The structures were small and weathered, their roofs sagging under snow, padlocks dangling from rusted doors. Max stopped at the farthest shed, barking furiously, pawing at the door. Emily pressed her ear against the wood. For a moment, only the storm howled. Then faint, muffled a child's whimper. "He's in there," Emily gasped. "I heard him." Daniel shoved at the door, but the lock held firm. Sarah arrived seconds later, radio in hand. She cursed under her breath. "Bolt cutters! Get a team here now!" "No time," Daniel snapped. He pulled his baton and struck the lock repeatedly until the metal snapped. He yanked the door open and the smell of damp wood and stale air rushed out. Inside, huddled on the floor, was a small boy in a red jacket, his face streaked with tears and dirt. His wrists were bound loosely with rope, which Daniel cut quickly. The boy clung to him, sobbing into his coat. The park erupted with movement as other officers rushed over. Sarah knelt beside the boy, checking him over with surprising gentleness. Relief washed across her face, softening the usual severity in her features. "He's cold, but alive," she murmured. She glanced at Emily and Max, her expression shifting. "You found him." News spread fast. By the time the boy was reunited with his parents, a small crowd had gathered despite the storm. Whispers ran through the air, people pointing not at Daniel but at the ragged girl and her dog. For weeks, Emily had been dismissed as a street child, a nobody. Now, under the falling snow, she was hailed as the girl who had helped save a life. Someone whispered, "That's the one." The girl with the shepherd. Heroes. Emily's cheeks flushed red, not from cold but from the strange weight of admiration. She pressed into Max, who wagged his tail as though he understood. For once, no one sneered, no one called her stray, but admiration from strangers could not change the law. Later that week, Daniel found himself sitting across from Judge Rebecca Halpern in a cramped courtroom fighting for Emily's future. Judge Halpern was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her dark eyes were keen, her manner firm but not unkind. She had presided over countless cases of neglect and abandonment, each one carving deeper into her belief that the system often failed the children it was meant to protect. She had grown up in foster care herself after her mother's early death, and though she rarely spoke of it, it shaped her sympathy for the young. Daniel stood before her in his uniform, his words steady, though his heart pounded. Emily Parker deserves more than the streets. She deserves stability. She deserves a home. I know protocol says she belongs in foster care, but she's already bonded with me and with Max. If she's taken from him, she'll lose the only family she has left. The judge studied Emily, who sat quietly beside Max at the defense table. The dog lay curled at her feet, his amber eyes scanning the room with unshakable vigilance. Emily clutched her notebook in her lap, the one filled with drawings. When asked if she wished to speak, she stood timidly, her small voice carrying across the room. I don't want to be moved again. I don't want to lose Max. Officer Carter. He makes me feel safe, like I belong. The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor, a weary woman in a gray suit with glasses perched on her nose, shifted uncomfortably, the fight gone from her posture. After a long pause, Judge Halpern delivered her ruling. Officer Carter, guardianship is not a duty we give lightly. But I believe in second chances for children, for families, even for those society overlooks. You are granted temporary custody of Emily Parker, with a review in 6 months. And as for the dog, he stays. A child should not be separated from her protector. Emily gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. Max barked once, as though echoing the decision. Daniel felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. That night, on Christmas Eve, Daniel carried a small tree into the modest apartment he had called home for years. The walls were plain, the furniture simple, but under the glow of firelight it felt transformed. Emily sat on the floor stringing popcorn with clumsy fingers. Max sprawled beside her with his head in her lap. Daniel watched them, the warmth in his chest greater than the fire itself. Snow fell thick outside the window, blanketing the city in silence. Inside, laughter echoed softly as Emily held up her finished string of popcorn, proud despite its crookedness. Daniel took it and draped it over the tree, his hands brushing hers. For the first time in years, his home felt complete. There, in the flickering light, 3 souls who had once been broken found themselves bound together, not by duty, not by circumstance, but by love. The storm outside raged on, but within those walls they had built something stronger than winter's cold, a family. In the end, the story of Daniel, Emily, and Max is more than just about a policeman, a little girl, and a loyal dog. It is about how love can grow even in the coldest winters, and how God can place miracles in the most unexpected places. Sometimes he sends us an angel not with wings, but in the form of a child's courage or a dog's loyalty. It reminds us that in our own daily lives, even the smallest acts of kindness can change someone's entire world. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the miracles you may have already received in your own life. Share this video so that others can also feel this warmth. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of hope. And above all, let us pray together that God continues to bless and protect every family, every child, and every heart that seeks love. If you believe in the power of faith and second chances, write Amen in the comments.